In the autumn of 2001, a man dressed as a bird climbed into a tiny open aircraft in central Wisconsin and taught a class of young cranes how to fly to Florida. That is not a joke, and it is not a metaphor. The pilot wore a full white costume from head to ankles because the birds were never allowed to see a human being. He had not spoken a word in front of them since they hatched. And when the ultralight took off, the cranes lifted off the marsh behind it and followed him south for more than 1,000 miles. They did this every year for 15 years. The bird is the whooping crane, the tallest bird in North America, close to 5 feet, standing with a wingspan around 7.5 feet, white with a red crown and a call that carries for miles. By 1941, the entire migrating flock had fallen to 15 birds. 15. Every whooping crane alive on Earth today is descended from that one group. So the obvious question is why anyone thought the answer was aircraft. If you have a nearly extinct bird and you can breed it in captivity, and you clearly could, because they did, then you hatch more cranes and you let them go. That is how this normally works. They tried that, the cranes would not migrate. And the reason why is the strangest thing in this entire story, because the piece that had gone missing was not the birds. The birds were fixable. What had nearly gone extinct was something the birds knew. Whooping cranes were never common. Estimates of the original population vary quite a bit, but by 1860 there were probably somewhere around 1,400 left. And from there, the line goes almost straight down. Two things did it, and neither is complicated. The first is that they are enormous and white and loud. A 5-foot bird standing in an open marsh is not a difficult target, and in an era of unregulated hunting, that mattered. They were shot for meat, for feathers, and for collections. The second is that their home was drained. Whooping cranes need shallow wetland, and across the middle of the continent, wetland is exactly what got converted to farmland through the late 1800s and early 1900s. The prairie potholes and marshes they depended on were ditched and planted. There was nowhere left to stand. But the thing that made this collapse so nearly permanent is the crane itself biologically. They do not breed until they are 3 or 4 years old. They mate for life. They typically lay 2 eggs and usually raise 1 chick, and often none. They can live close to 30 years, which sounds like an advantage until you realize it means each generation takes forever to replace itself. Take an animal that reproduces that slowly and shoot most of them, and there is no quick recovery available. Even with perfect protection, the math climbs at a crawl. Protection did come. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act made hunting them illegal in 1918. In 1937, the government established the Aransas National Wildlife Refuge on the Texas coast, specifically to protect the wintering ground. And in 1941, the count came back at 15. There was a second small population, non-migratory, living year-round in Louisiana. Not long after it was gone. So the entire species narrowed to one flock on one route, breeding in one place, wintering in one place. That is what a bottleneck looks like. The bird was not extinct, but it was down to a single thread. Protecting that one flock worked slowly, exactly as slowly as the biology predicted. The population sat under 30 birds through the 1950s. By the 1960s, it had crawled into the 40s, and that created a new problem, which was arithmetic rather than biology. Every whooping crane in the world was doing the same thing, breeding in the same corner of northern Canada, flying the same corridor, wintering on the same stretch of Texas coast. Which means one hurricane at Aransas in the wrong week, or one oil spill in the wrong bay, or one disease sweeping the flock, and the entire species is finished in a single season. There is no backup. So the goal became obvious: build a second flock somewhere else so the species is not sitting on one thread. And they had the tools. Beginning in 1966, biologists at the Patuxent Wildlife Research Center started a captive breeding program with a handful of eggs collected from the wild. Over the following decades, they got genuinely good at it. They could produce whooping cranes, then they released them, and it did not work. The captive-bred birds did not do what wild whooping cranes do. Released in one place, they did not travel to another place when the weather turned. Some stayed put through conditions they could not survive. Some wandered off in no useful direction at all. They had wings, they had instincts, they had every physical thing a whooping crane is supposed to have. They simply did not know where to go. And that is the sentence that reframes the whole story. Producing more cranes was never going to be enough, because the thing the species was missing could not be hatched. Here is the piece almost nobody knows about migratory cranes, and once you know it, everything else in this story follows. A whooping crane does not inherit its migration route, it learns it. Some birds do carry their routes genetically more or less. Cranes do not work that way. A young crane makes the journey once in its first autumn, flying alongside its parents, and the route goes in. Where to leave from, which way to go, where the safe stopovers are, where to end up. Then it flies that route for the rest of its life and eventually teaches it to its own chicks, which means the route is not really a fact about the bird. It is information held in living memory and handed down from one generation to the next for thousands of years. Think of it like a recipe that was never written down and exists only in one family. You can have every ingredient on the counter and a perfect kitchen in the right pans, and you still cannot make the dish because the part that mattered was never in the ingredients. The 15 survivors still had their recipe. That flock knew the way from wood buffalo down to Aransas, and it kept passing it along, which is the only reason the wild population held together at all. But the captive-bred chicks had nobody. Their parents were in an enclosure in Maryland and had never flown anywhere. There was no adult in their world who knew the route, so there was nothing for them to copy. You can breed a crane. You cannot breed a map. So the fix had to be a transfer of knowledge from us to them, and that is where it gets strange. First, the chicks had to be raised without ever learning that humans exist. A crane that imprints on people is useless in the wild, so handlers wore full white costumes, used puppet heads shaped like adult crane heads to feed them, kept taxidermied models in the pens, and never spoke aloud in the bird's presence. Not once. Then somebody had to teach them the route, which meant somebody had to fly it in front of them. That idea already existed. A Canadian named Bill Lishman, later joined by Joe Duff, had led Canada geese behind an ultralight from Ontario to Virginia in 1993, which is the story the film Fly Away Home is based on. In 2000, the team proved it on cranes, leading 11 sandhill cranes from Wisconsin to Florida. The following year, they tried it with whooping cranes. And here is the detail that makes the whole thing worth it. They only had to do it once per bird. The aircraft was not a permanent chauffeur service. It was a one-time delivery of information. The young cranes flew the route behind the plane in the autumn, learned it, and then in the spring, they flew north again, on their own, unaccompanied, with nobody leading them. From then on, it was theirs, and their chicks would learn it from them. They were not flying the birds south. They were handing back a piece of knowledge the species had lost, and hoping it would start being inherited again. It worked. Between 2001 and 2015, class after class of young whooping cranes was costume reared in Wisconsin, trained to follow the aircraft over the marsh through the summer, and then led on the long trip to the Gulf Coast of Florida. And every spring, the survivors came back north by themselves. A second migratory flock existed for the first time in modern history. It is called the Eastern Migratory Population, and it runs between Wisconsin and Florida, and today it numbers around 90 birds. It cost a great deal to get there, and not only in money. In February 2007, 18 young cranes that had just completed the ultralight migration were in a holding pen at the Chassahowitzka Refuge in Florida when violent storms came through overnight. In the morning, 17 were dead. The team went out to recover the bodies and found that one was missing, and later that day, they found it alive, standing with a pair of sandhill cranes. An entire year's class gone in a night with one survivor. The ultralights stopped after 2015. The partnership running the project decided to move away from aircraft-led migration toward other rearing methods, in part because the ultralight birds were struggling to raise chicks of their own once they got there. That is a real limitation, and it is worth stating plainly. The method delivered the route. It did not solve everything that came after, but the numbers taken together are remarkable. The wild Aransas to wood buffalo flock, the original one, the one descended from those 15 birds, hit a record in the 2024 to 2025 survey with an estimated 557 cranes wintering in Texas. Add the eastern flock, a non migratory group in Louisiana of around 70, a small Florida population, and the birds still in captivity, and the world total is somewhere north of 800, from 15. Now, the honest part, because this is not a species that has been rescued and released. The whooping crane is still endangered. The Texas flock is the only wild population that is genuinely self sustaining, and the introduced flocks still need people involved. Every bird alive came from those 15 survivors, which means the genetic diversity of the entire species is extremely narrow, and that is not a thing you can fix later. This is a recovery that has been running for 80 years and is nowhere near finished. But step back and look at what actually made this different from every other story on this channel. In all the others, the missing piece was physical: water on a dead lake bed, a wall taken out of a river, fire on a forest floor, soil that had washed off a mountain. Even in the last episode, when a woodpecker had nowhere to nest, the answer was a wooden box, which is a thing you can build. Here, the missing piece was not a thing at all, it was a root, held in the heads of birds, taught by parents to chicks, one autumn at a time for thousands of years. And when enough of the birds carrying it died, that information started going extinct on its own schedule, separately from the animal. We tend to think of extinction as bodies, a count that goes to zero. But a species is also everything it has figured out and passed down, and that can disappear while the animal is still standing right in front of you. You can save the crane and still lose the way home, which is why the strangest looking conservation project in American history is really quite simple once you see it properly. A man put on a costume, got into a small aircraft, and flew slowly south so that a bird flying behind him would remember something its species had forgotten. Everything else the cranes did themselves: subscribe and watch the world come back to life.